Now, most people in the West are unfamiliar with the Chinese classic novel Dream of the Red Chamber. People who are familiar with it tend to think of it as some sort of tragic love story. Now, there are a few people who know more, but those tend to think of it as some sort of religious allegory of some sort. Well, what would you think if I told you that they were all wrong? Because the truth is that they are all wrong. Now, I'm going to tell you this, the more that I read this book, the more clear it is to me that this book at its core is about social criticism, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Well, as you may or may not already know, I'm in the middle of retranslating Dream of the Red Chamber into English. In fact, I'm doing this publicly on my blog, redchamber.blog. I'm going slowly too. I'm sacrificing pace in order to dig deep and make sure that we understand everything that's going on. Well, you know, any old fool can read a book really quickly and just miss all the details or skim over stuff that's difficult, but where's the fun in that? So we're going through the Chinese original slowly on my blog. We've been talking about all the interesting things that tend to be lost in English translations, and we continue to ask questions about anything that doesn't make sense to us. And don't you think that's the best way to read? There is a famous scene in the middle of the 3rd chapter where the two main characters meet for the first time. Oh yeah, by the way, it's not even until the 3rd chapter that they finally meet. In fact, neither of the two main characters are even introduced until the 3rd chapter. It's kind of a special book that way, and I don't recommend writing your own books like this. Well, in the great Chinese tradition, both characters are introduced through long poetic passages. Jia Baoyu, the main character, receives 2 descriptive poems about him, both of which seem to be quite negative. He courts sorrow and hunts grief without any reason. He's stubborn and decides not to study. He doesn't care if anybody scolds him. He wastes his youth away and is simply useless to everybody around him. And on it goes. Now, poor Jia Baoyu can't really buy a break, but when you get to the description of the female character, Lin Daiyu, things really start to get interesting. You see, the description of Lin Daiyu when she first appears to Jia Baoyu contains a particular phrase that is very difficult to translate and that touches on the philosophic heart of the novel. That would be this poetic phrase, 两万此处非处龙眼媚，一双此喜非喜含情目. Now, if you line the characters up, and if you happen to speak Chinese, you can see that these passages are perfectly parallel. The translation is also pretty easy. Her eyebrows were like a faint mist, neither knit nor smooth. Her eyes had a dreamy sweetness, neither glad nor sad. Okay, a bit of a note here. What I mean when I say knit eyebrows, I mean furrowed downward like you're in a frown. That's what the Chinese word cu means in that first line. Smooth eyebrows would be the opposite. She's got her eyebrows up in a smile. So the Chinese original also says that her eyebrows were like a faint mist and were somewhere between the smile and a frown all the time. But the thing is, that's not really the interesting part. Nope, the fascinating part is this phrase right here, Han Qing Mu. Now, David Hawkes, whose translation, The Story of the Stone, is the translation the academic world still uses, translated this phrase as passionate eyes. And, as I'm going to say a lot, Professor David Hawkes was wrong. Look, Professor Hawkes was great at translating poetry. He translated this book. He spent over a decade doing it. It was really his life's work, and he's received a lot of credit for it. But he was absolutely wrong here, and he is also wrong elsewhere, and I'm going to prove it to you. Back to the phrase, Han Qing Mu. In Chinese, it literally means eyes filled with qing. Now, qing is this character. It means a bunch of different things, and it shows up all over the place in the original Chinese version of Dream of the Red Chamber. Check out what Wiktionary says. Qing could be feeling, sentiment, emotion, love, affection, sexual desire, feelings, even reason, or even circumstances in the right context. And in this case, the meaning of that word qing is actually really important. It's important because it keeps coming up in really important places in the novel. And by the way, none of this is going to be apparent to you if you're only reading the English translation. So way back in the first chapter of Dream of the Red Chamber, we ran into a bizarre story about the Taoist Kong Kong, who goes through this kind of transformation after he reads the book. This is the passage. It means, starting then, the Taoist Kong Kong saw form and emptiness, felt emotion through that form, brought the emotion into form, and then realized emptiness from that form. Now, if you can read Chinese, you're going to wonder why I translated sa as form instead of color. That is because sa here is actually a Buddhist term. It is the Chinese translation of the Sanskrit word rupa. That word rupa refers to the material world. It's everything that we see. It's our bodies, our computers, our books, all of our stuff. So when Kong Kong looked into that emptiness, he saw that all this stuff was there. He then felt emotion through that stuff. That's where the word qing comes into play. It should mean emotion. He then brought that emotion into that stuff, all the material world stuff, the rupa that we just mentioned. And then once he was done with that material world stuff, he realized emptiness, or he achieved enlightenment. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering what in the world this has to do with anything. That's because neither you nor I grew up in a Buddhist household in the mid-18th century in China. So the truth is that the author, Cao Shui-Qin, who is author of Dream of the Red Chamber, he is engaging in an act of subversive authorship. He's taking something that was well known to his readers and he is deliberately changing it. He's altering its meaning. This is a phrase from the Heart Sutra. It should look familiar. It means form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Of course, we know that sa, what we're calling form, is actually rupa, or the material world around us. In other words, what this sentence is really telling us is that everything around us amounts to emptiness, and that emptiness itself is not separate from form, but is actually part of the same reality. Okay, that sounds a little bit strange. So this teaching is basically that everything in our lives, all the stuff that we have, the books that we have, our bodies, maybe even our thoughts, desires, and so on, all of this becomes empty in the end. But in the end, that emptiness that is at the heart of everything is actually what makes the dynamic world of ours possible. Now, I guess that's kind of interesting and profound, especially if you're of Buddhist persuasion. But we have to remember that Cao Shui-Qin, when he was writing this, threw that qing in there. So what is qing doing? What does that mean? Well, Cao Shui-Qin's argument is that the only way we can really reach enlightenment in the end is through qing. You start with emptiness and you notice it in the world around you. But when you see that world around you, you cannot help but feel qing. Well, this gives us a hint as to what qing actually means here, as well as in the rest of the book. It cannot be just romance or lust. It just can't. Qing has to include other emotions. It has to include sorrow, anger, frustration, hate, heartache, nostalgia, longing, hunger, and on and on and on. It's basically everything that makes us human. And that's what Cao Shui-Qin is adding to his story. So when he writes qing, or emotion, or everything that makes us human is then transmitted into the material world or form or whatever it is, what Cao Shui-Qin means is that the emotion spills out of him, the Taoist Kong Kong, and into every single thing that he does. And then in the end, Kong Kong is awakened to emptiness. And as I understand it, this flies in the face of Buddhist dogma. Now, I might be wrong. Please let me know in the comments. Oh, and by the way, we can see this in the novel as well. In fact, we can see it in the very first chapter. After he loses everything, poor old Zhen Shiyin is visited by a Taoist priest who mocks him with the so-called Hao Liao Ge, or Hao Liao song. So the Hao Liao song is pretty brutal. Forget about fortune and fame, we're all gonna die anyway. Forget about gold and silver, we'll only die in the end. Don't worry about your spouse will find another when you die. Don't worry about your children, they'll never care for you anyway. It's brutal, it's horrible, it's heartless, and it also happens to reflect the Buddhist and Taoist religious thought of Cao Shui-Qin's day, or at least as he saw it. So I guess you could say that this line of thinking is like a real perverse type of stoicism, or fatalism taken to its logical extreme. We can't do anything, so let's just do nothing, and it will all go away someday, so we might as well just give up. Zhen Shiyin responds with an emotion-filled lament. He describes everything, the shabby room, the hollow hall, now filled with weeds. He talks about the chest overflowing with gold and silver today, but leaving you poor tomorrow. He describes the crimson silk drapes of lovebirds that flow over the ground where your white bones were buried yesterday into the yellow earth. And he describes sons turning to banditry and daughters turning to the steamy side of life. And as I mentioned in another video the other day, he concludes that it's all absurd and that you're just sewing somebody else's bridal clothes in the end. Now, interestingly enough, Zhen Shiyin doesn't actually use that word qing anywhere in his poetic response. But the thing is that he doesn't need to use the word. His poem embodies that concept. And that's the really fantastic part of all of this. It's not just that Cao Shui-Qin is making creative use of a difficult to translate noun. He is literally showing us what he meant through the lament of Zhen Shiyin. And so we go back to that passage about Lin Daiyu. The Han Qing Mu are not passionate eyes. They are eyes filled with deep emotion, eyes that are actually overflowing with emotion. Okay, that is Lin Daiyu. But even if you've read this book several times in English or even in Chinese, I guarantee you that there's a part that you didn't notice. Cao Shuiqing uses very similar language to describe Jia Baoyu. That would be this part right here. It's another difficult phrase. I translate it as a lifetime of romantic longing gathered at the corner of his eyes. Now forget about the eyes and their corners for a second and look at the Chinese. Here it says Ping Sheng Wang Zhong Qing Si, which literally means a lifetime of thinking about Qing 10,000 different ways. Now, you see, the thing that attracts Jia Baoyu to Lin Daiyu is the way that her emotions dictate her character. They define her, they flow through her. You could say that her character is nothing but these emotions. Jia Baoyu himself is also overflowing with these emotions. And it's the sort of emotions that simply cannot survive in the society that they've been born into. There's your social criticism. In fact, Jia Baoyu's unruly nature is because of the emotions that he feels within himself. He wants to be with women and dislikes men, but this isn't because he's a playboy. It likely is because of the strained relationship with his father Jia Zheng, who displays absolutely no emotions whatsoever. And that is why this book is so undeniably modern. Think about it. How many times have you heard people talk about toxic masculinity or about how people need to learn how to express their emotions? This is exactly what Cao Shuiqing is talking about. He sees the same problems, the same toxicity in his society, like mid-18th century China, and his answer to it was to write a very long novel with characters whose emotions are so active and so strong that they literally define who they are. It's fascinating. Anyway, long story short, this is not just another love story. It is a story filled to the brim with social criticism and one that addresses some of the most sensitive issues in life, including life today. The more you read it and the more you understand this, the more this book draws you in. Anyway, I'm going to keep it there for now, though there are actually a lot of other examples of this in just the first 3 chapters of this book. As we go forward, I'll continue to point this stuff out to you. But long story short is that you really can't understand Dream of the Red Chamber without having at least a commentary to help you, even if you're reading it in Chinese. And the other thing is that the only way to really engage with this book is by engaging with the Chinese original and not just engaging with English translations. Talk to you later.